This is the
Five Stars
podcast.
Let me talk to you.
Hi.
So, what do you guys want to talk about? Tell me we're not telling lies.
Thanks, guys. Back to you.
All right, here we go. What's going on, everyone? It's another Friday. It is also Valentine's Day, if that's something people still actually celebrate. It is simultaneously one of the most rewarding holidays as well as one of the most depressing holidays, depending on your relationship status. All you single guys out there know what I'm talking about. I mean, everybody celebrates it differently. I celebrate it by doing absolutely nothing. Just treating it like a standard day of the year. Because that's exactly what it is. February 14th. Nothing remotely special about it. I also get to laugh at all the poor saps that go out of their way to buy chocolates and flowers for their significant others and just wasting money on dumb materialistic stuff. I've never actually bought chocolate or flowers for anybody. And I've never understood why those two things are synonymous with Valentine's gifts. Like, you think about all the potential things you could buy your girlfriend or wife or fiance, whatever the case. Chocolate and flowers. Now, where are you going to find flowers during the month of February that won't immediately die after 2 weeks? And what kind of chocolate are you getting? Like that box stuff they sell at drugstores? Do you know how contaminated that stuff is? I know that's typical me on this channel, finding ways to ruin what's supposed to be a special holiday for loved ones. And when you get red-pilled like me over time, you realize just how fake and artificial all that bull crap is. If you actually have somebody in your life that genuinely cares about you, why does Valentine's Day even matter? That's the problem when you program a society of people to believe, oh, I have to buy my significant other something to show my appreciation for them. Because I don't do it 364 other days out of the year. Just keep drinking the Kool-Aid, man. Someday people will wake up. But I hope everyone's doing well. It is Friday, so we're back for another round of classic wrestling talk here on the Five Starr Wrestling Report. Make sure you subscribe, comment, and like the show if you have not already. We are the wrestling podcast nobody knows but everybody needs. You find us on YouTube and Rumble on Mondays and Fridays for classic coverage and a whole other laundry list of fun stuff. Today we've got the Clash of Champions to review here with WCW. It sounds exciting in theory, but it really wasn't that grand of a show, all things considered. We've also got Midsouth and World Class to talk about as well. A packed show as normal. And I talk about it all the time, but I appreciate the people that come back to support the channel every week, whether you're watching on YouTube or Rumble. Make sure you stay posted with all future videos by subscribing, giving the show a like, leaving a comment, and make sure you have that notification bell turned on if you're watching on YouTube. And just to show that I'm not a totally cold-hearted prick, if you're one of those people that celebrate Valentine's Day and treat it like an actual holiday, well, I wish you a happy one. Hope it works out for you. So, who's ready to talk about the 5th Clash of Champions event? Hey, remember when they advertised the fuck out of that first Clash event in March of '88? The card that had 2 outstanding legendary matches that stood the test of time. Obviously, I'm referring to the Midnights versus the Fantastics for the U.S. Heavyweight Tag Titles and the Sting Flair 45-minute Broadway. My, has the tide shifted in the last year. 11 months later, and we're basically looking at a glorified house show for the Clash of Champions here in Cleveland, Ohio at the Convention Center. A rock-solid 5,000 people in attendance for this puppy. Frankly, I'm shocked they even drew that. I'm not exaggerating when I say, at no point in watching those Saturday TBS shows did the announcers plug this Clash event once. Not one time. I swear to God, I'm not even trying to pull your leg. Absolutely zero mention of anything regarding this Clash event in any promotional capacity. It's almost as if they wanted people to completely forget it was a thing. Which, of course, makes me start wondering how the hell people even knew about the event, period. I mean, they would have had to promote it somehow. I guess on the Sunday syndicated show. And judging how piss poor the card was overall, there's no wonder they wanted people to avoid watching this thing. I'll be honest with you, I'm not even sure how long I'm going to spend trying to run down this card. There were 2, arguably 3 matches that were even remotely what you might consider house show quality matches, whereas the rest of the card was filled with a bunch of meaningless underneath filler that would have been better suited for studio wrestling. The only match on this show that they even vaguely built up on television was the main event 6-man. And even so, it was our first time seeing Tenryu on an NWA show in any featured capacity. And as it turns out, that match didn't even happen. So way to go, guys. But again, going back to last year when I made the decision to review the Clash events as part of the NWA review series, even though the events are about to become substantially less meaningful over time, due in large part to the complete ineptitude of the people in charge of this company, I do want to at least touch on them and review as many as I can, even if I don't fully go down the rabbit hole in terms of reviewing the cards. But let's go ahead and talk about one of the few highlights on this Clash event. It is a completely cold tag match with Jim Cornette's Midnight Express taking on the Russian Assassins. And for the people saying this was considered a highlight on the Clash event, goes to show how forgettable it was. In the midst of Bobby, Stan, and Jim still feuding with Paulie's original Midnight Express, here they are a week before the Chi-Town Rumble, wrestling Paul Jones's Russian Assassins in a completely random tag match with no build or story. And they had what I can reasonably call a solid house show match that nobody had any rhyme or reason to care about. And I'm not even trying to vilify Dave Shelton or Jack Victory when I say that. But, I mean, the Assassins have been well established as underneath guys by this point. They were solely put together with the purpose of feuding with Ivan and Nikita last year. And once that program fell through, there was no reason to keep them around other than to have a set of interchangeable masked heels and to keep Paul Jones on television longer. And they try to keep it mildly interesting here with Paul and Cornette teasing going at it a few times. At one point, Cornette lured Paul Jones over so that Stan Lane could throw a few punches at him, which Paul barely sold. And they had Corny whip the heels with his tennis racket a couple times behind Tommy Young's back. They worked a heat spot on Stan so they could sell for a little bit, give the heels a chance to slow the pace down and build to the big comeback. They also did some twin magic stuff. And then Beautiful Bobby gets in there and runs wild. It breaks down with all four guys. There's a spot where you see one of the Assassins throw Bobby over the top rope directly in front of Tommy Young's face. This did not automatically lead to a disqualification. Instead, they kept wrestling. There was a miscue spot where one of the Assassins headbutted the other Assassin with his loaded mask. And then the Midnights end up going over with the rocket launcher. I repeat what I said at the top. This was a rare highlight on this Clash card. An average, decent tag match in the curtain jerker spot. This did not bode well for what was to come in the next hour and 30 minutes. Oh, and Paul Heyman was also out there to do commentary with Magnum and JR at one point. It was not as exhilarating as you might expect. He just said a bunch of words, tried to get some last-minute heat on himself before the Chi-Town Rumble showdown next week. And boy, what a showdown that was. He was advertising a match of some description, but it wasn't the one that he was trying to get over. Then we came back from a commercial with Ricky Steamboat and Bob Caudle. And alongside both of them was Little Richie Steamboat, hogging the spotlight yet again. And this is just amazing because you get Ricky out there trying to do this button-down white meat babyface promo, talking about wanting to support his family and bring the American people together, teaching kids to stay away from drugs and live safe lives. All the while, there's little Richie trying to play with the microphone while he's in the middle of his rambling. And Bob Caudle standing there trying to hold back from laughing the whole time as he's realizing that Richie might steal away his mic as a shoot. It also made me laugh because Bob Caudle is literally hollering his questions right in front of poor Richie's face. I'm like, chill out, dude. You need to give this kid a mental breakdown here on live television. Guy's a toddler. You don't need to scream into the fucking mic. I think this is where they started to jump the shark a little bit with the Ricky Steamboat babyface push. Like, it's one thing to bring your wife and kid out there and talk about family values, but now you can tell they're legitimately just trying to shove it down people's throats. Like, him constantly bringing Richie out in front of the camera like that. It's like, hey, check out this cute kid dressed like his dad. Isn't it cute? So cute, damn it. I mean, it kind of was, but it was also very annoying that they had to shove it in my face constantly. Better him than his wife, I guess. Small favors. And then we came to the low point of this card. Hacksaw Butch Reed versus Steve Casey. Hideously boring match. I could not believe how much fucking time they allotted to this thing. I know they had 2 hours to kill, but Jesus Christ. Out of all the matches on this card, who made the decision, let's give Butch Reed and Steve Casey 17 minutes in the ring together? "17 minutes? I nearly lost it. In addition to the fans totally not giving a shit, it got to a point where I was convinced the camera crew was trying to find ways to amuse themselves with all the crowd shots, just trying to find the most obscure fan shots they could capture on film. Ironically, I think the best one was the very first crowd shot they got, where they showed the couple making out in plain view of God and everybody. JR deadpan just goes, "Well, ain't that special?" And to be blunt, that was all highly more interesting than watching Reed and Casey do wrist locks and chin locks and tests of strength lockups for 15 goddamn minutes. I'm telling you, this is one of those matches that I could literally feel every second tick by. And I hate using the term feel. I try to avoid it as much as humanly possible. In this case, it was very appropriate usage of the term. I think the sun did about 4 full rotations around the solar system before this fucking match ended. Casey sold and sold forever. Nobody in the crowd cared. He made a cough comeback on Reed. And then Reed shit-canned him with a military press. Went up and hit a flying shoulder block. And I wrote, "Mercifully it ends." You know how I joke about not doing star ratings because I think that whole system is broken to begin with? If you were to ask me, what would I give this match on the Dave Meltzer star rating system? I would go in the polar opposite direction of the 5-star scale. I would go -6.5. -0.5 for the boring wrestling match. -6 because these numbnuts decided to give it 17 minutes and change. Horrible. Thank God the next segment made up for it in spades. Now this right here, this is a classic. It's one of those angles that you see once and you never forget it. It becomes instantly iconic. Like, this is so great. I'd have paid a ticket to attend the show live literally just to see this. This could have been the whole show and I would have been perfectly content. So here comes Ric Flair. And he's styling and profiling to the ring with his lovely escorts. Comes out wearing his custom suit, custom fur coat, his $50,000 Rolex, shades, perfectly primmed hair, the whole 9 yards. So immediately you can already sense that something's about to happen. And he gets in the ring and starts doing the Ric Flair thing. Having the girls pose for the camera. Talking about how the average fan watching will never get the opportunities that Flair's had in life because they're not on his level. Of course, he's trying to be a heel when he says all this, but the vast majority of the fans are cheering him. And it's all just usual Flair showboating until he calls out Ricky Steamboat and says, "Why don't you take your pick of the litter, pal? You must be bored sitting at home all the time, not getting any action from your old lady." So here comes Steamboat, and he's less than amused with Flair's antics here. And at first, Steamboat just kind of stands face to face with Flair with his hands on his hips. Meanwhile, Flair's telling Steamboat that he should just walk away from the Chi-Town Rumble and save himself the embarrassment. And unfortunately, this is kind of where you could see the dynamic shift a little bit with the personality traits. Is Steamboat telling Flair that he hates everything he represents. He hates the idea that he cherishes materialistic possessions over family and morals. And it's like, I mean, it's admirable babyface stuff that you would expect to hear from a Ricky Steamboat. But as soon as the fans heard him diminish what Flair stands for, like, you can automatically hear a good portion of the crowd start to boo Ricky. They're like, "No, fuck you. We like Flair being a pompous, arrogant prick. We like it when he flashes his materialistic possessions." So you can already start to see it going south a little bit. And not to mention, Ricky was never all that great of a promo, so I don't think the fans are really buying it. But they managed to turn it around when Flair tells Steamboat that he can go sauntering back to his miserable, boring lifestyle. But Flair's going to go party with his lovely gals. And that's when you see Ricky throw the first punch. And as someone famous once quoted in the wrestling business, "It is on like Donkey Kong." And this is where the segment became iconic. Steamboat and Flair going at it, throwing chops. Steamboat's going right after Flair's custom suit, stripping him down to his bra and panties. And like, that in and of itself was already hilarious. But I'm laughing the whole time because while these guys are in the middle of the street fight, you got Bob Caudle and the valets just standing around the ring watching. There's no real sense of urgency for anybody to get him out of the ring. Every so often, Flair and Steamboat would accidentally bump into somebody. Then they would just casually start walking in the other direction to avoid getting mauled. I was dying watching this go on. Meanwhile, Flair's out there basically wearing nothing but his underwear and socks. And they eventually fight out to the floor where they end up going over the guardrail and into the crowd briefly before they cut the feed. People are going apeshit for all this, by the way. I mean, what more can you say? It's an all-time great angle. I think that's mostly due to the visual of seeing Flair out there in nothing but his undergarments and old man socks. But even the stuff that preceded it, Flair trying to verbally rip apart Steamboat, Steamboat going after him one last time before the pay-per-view and getting one last chance to humiliate Flair in public. It was all great stuff. And it follows the pattern of every Flair Steamboat angle they previously established on television. Every single time Flair's tried to get the better of Steamboat, he's failed every step of the way. And of course, watching in 2025, booking logic 101 for modern fans would dictate, the babyface has gotten the leg up on the heel way too often. And there's no possible way the bad guy isn't winning the first match, right? Well, stay tuned. That's all I can say. And to tell you the truth, they could have ended the show right there and I would have been perfectly satisfied. But they still had another hour of TV time remaining. So they attempted to follow that extremely hot TV angle with Lex Luger versus the Blackmailer, who I'm pretty sure was just Jack Victory wrestling under a bodysuit and mask. So Victory was one of the many guys on the show pulling double duty. He wrestled in the opener as the Russian Assassin number 2. Then he had to come out an hour later and do a job to Luger as the Blackmailer. I hope they gave that guy a reasonable payoff. Sorry to spoil the fun here. Luger versus the Blackmailer for 13 minutes was not as good as the Flair Steamboat angle. I also really can't explain how or why it took Luger 13 minutes to beat a masked jobber named the Blackmailer, a gimmick we've never seen previously on television before. And for those that may be wondering, why was Hiro Matsuda managing him? Your guess is as good as mine. Probably the same reason he was also managing Butch Reed, Ric Flair, and Barry Windham. The answer was, why the hell not? There was approximately one Luger fan in the crowd during this event. They had a sign that read, Lex Luger Total Package. No punctuation. And I shit you not, it may have been the size of your average sheet of printer paper. This was not a sign they wanted to garner attention. Luger controlled the bulk of the action early on. He ended up missing a charge and took a bump out to the floor. The Blackmailer worked him over for the quote-unquote heat. And then Luger fired up at the end. He made his Hogan-esque no-sell comeback. And, well, you know how Luger kind of made a career out of solely getting over one move? That being the rack. Guess what he used as a finish here? Not the rack. Instead, he stole Barry Windham's superplex, and he pinned the Blackmailer that way. Not a particularly good superplex, but he got the job done. And that makes sense. They're obviously teasing a feud with Luger and Barry for the U.S. title, so it worked in context. This may have been the only match I've seen outside Luger's work in the WWF where he did not use the rack as a finishing move. But, yeah, that was that. Second longest match on the card, by the way. Behind that interminable Butch Reed-Steve Casey slog that still might be going on to this day, I don't even know. And then we came back for the featured bout on this Clash event. One of the featured bouts, that is. For the U.S. Heavyweight Tag Titles, Dr. Death, Steve Williams, and Mike Rotunda defend against the Fantastics. Now, up to this point, we didn't know about the angle they were about to shoot for the six-man main event. So we just kind of presumed this would be the only time the Varsity Club would appear on the card. Turns out that was not the case. Overall, it's a pretty good match. Couple clunky spots here where Williams and Fulton weren't on the same page. Some awkward miscues. But I really like the dynamics of the size discrepancies between both teams. Seeing Fulton and Rogers work with two bigger guys like Rotunda and Williams. It actually played perfectly into the story they've been telling on the TBS shows where the Varsity Club want to establish themselves as superior to the Road Warriors. They want to be the new big bad bullies on the block. And this worked great with the Fantastics being the baby faces in peril here. And both Rogers and Fulton got to sell for the heels and take a beating for a while. At one point, they did a spot where Fulton got dropped throat first over the ring barricade. So he did the thing where he comes back into the ring and you see him almost foaming at the mouth a little bit. Great facials, too. I did note the fans chanting retardo and Mike anytime he was on offense. The kinds of chants that you would never expect to hear in a modern context. And so they get to the end where everybody's doing four-way spots. We get the visual where Rogers comes off the top onto Williams, but Teddy Long is trying to hold back Fulton. And that allowed for Rotunda to run up and drop a knee over Rogers' neck. Then Williams stacked him up and got the 3. Yet at this stage, you can tell that Bobby and Tommy basically were on their way out. I think they end up coming back later in the year, sometime in early 90 for a brief run. But you could tell even by this point, they're essentially being used as prelim guys. And that may have played a part in them deciding to leave. I don't really know. Obviously, the Varsity Club retaining wasn't a big surprise to anybody. And again, as we're about to see later on the show, there was more to come with the Varsity Club. We had Ricky Steamboat going over Bob Bradley in a match that was so forgettable I neglected to write anything down about it. All I wrote is, more technical feedback and audio issues, which was prevalent through the entire show looking back. Because, you know, Turner employees trying to run and produce a wrestling show. Not necessarily the most competent people on the planet. Steamboat won with a diving crossbody off the top. We also had chance of "We Want Flair" during the point where Steamboat was in control of the match. Make of that as you wish. I blame Bonnie Steamboat. Then we had Rick Steiner and Rip Morgan. Okay, somebody help me out here. When they were laying out the format for this show, some brain trust operator in the back thought to themselves, we need to give Hacksaw Butch Reed versus Steve Casey 17 minutes. But Rick Steiner and Rip Morgan, those guys only need 5. Nobody wants to see those guys go for too long. Now you see that right there. That is the moment where you recognize as a fan, these people had no earthly clue what they were doing. Like, can you imagine? You're sitting there in the booking meeting trying to lay out this card. Someone pitches, hey, Rick Steiner versus Rip Morgan. Now that's a match we can give some time to, right? Then one of the Turner shills goes, nah. No, we need to give that time to Butch Reed and Steve Casey. Because that's what the people really want to see. Fucking geniuses. So, Steiner and Morgan had a reasonably okay hoss fight that got about 5 minutes. Maybe even less than that, looking back. It was just starting to get good. And then Steiner reversed a bear hug attempt and hit a belly-to-belly throw for the pin. I was like, that was it? Well, thanks for coming, Rip Morgan. Should have followed the sheepwhackers to the WWF. And like, in all seriousness, am I suggesting that I wanted to see Steiner and Morgan wrestle for 10 minutes? Probably not. But it sure would have been more preferable to give this match more time instead of cutting it short because they had to give Butch Reed and Steve Casey, did I mention, 17 God-blessed motherfucking minutes. Never going to get over that. Of all the terrible booking decisions made in the year 1989, Butch Reed versus Steve Casey, 17 minutes to a finish. That'll be the number one dumbest decision made by the end of the year. And yes, that also tops the ding-dongs. Oh, I didn't forget about the ding-dongs, trust me. I know those guys are coming. And they're coming hard. Anyway, let's talk about the main event. So, originally advertised, air quotes around advertised, it was supposed to be Sting, Michael Hayes, and JYD versus the Road Warriors and Tenryu for the 6-man tag titles. And you actually might remember on last week's TBS review, I made the joke, unless they can substantially prove that match ever took place, I refuse to believe they ever actually put that match in front of a live crowd. Because the idea of that on paper sounds atrocious. And of course, no sooner should I say that, as we're watching Sting, Hayes, and Dog doing an interview with Bob Caudle in the stairwell before they're set to go out and wrestle. I'm looking at Dog's Pillsbury Doughboy stomach. Just rows and rows of rolled up fat hanging over his ring tights. I'm like, there's no way this guy actually goes out to wrestle, right? I don't think he'd make it to the ring. Well, sure enough, as the babyfaces are going crazy here and talking about their plan to take the 6-man titles from Tenryu and the Road Warriors, well, first, they have to go back to their locker room to go over a game plan. Because apparently they didn't already pre-plan before they went to conduct this interview. And or at any other point during the event when they were sitting in the locker room twiddling their thumbs. So as they go down the stairwell, here comes Kevin Sullivan with a padlock. And he ends up chaining the door shut, which obviously leads into the basement of the building where Sting, Hayes, and Dog left. So they get trapped. They come back up shaking the door, trying to climb over the top, screaming for Caudle to go get somebody. And, well, you might be asking yourself, what did Bob Caudle do in this situation? Did he immediately try to seek help? Did he attempt to hunt down a janitor or somebody to grab a set of pliers to cut the padlock off the chain? Well, in fact, he did not. No, instead, like a complete fucking dick, Caudle just goes, Oh, this is a horrible situation we're in right now. Folks, we're going to break. Stay with us. As the cameraman and Bob Caudle stand there and do absolutely nothing. Sting, Hayes, and Dog are trapped behind this chain door. The cameraman continues to film them. What an asshole. So that leads to the sixth man. And taking the place of the now confined team of Hayes, Sting, and JYD, the Road Warriors and Tenryu find themselves defending the six-man belts against the Varsity Club. Oh, well, how about that? And this whole thing is amazing because while these six guys are in the ring having a literal Pier 6 brawl, they're occasionally cutting to a split screen where they show Doug Dillinger epically failing to try to break the lock on this cage door. And you see Hayes, Sting, and Dog screaming for this idiot to hurry up and break the fucking lock. All the while I'm just like, you didn't think to bring bolt cutters? You're trying to pick the lock with a fucking hairpin? Is it that hard? You're in a giant arena with hundreds of storage spaces and closets. Surely there has to be a bolt cutter somewhere within close proximity of this arena. So, fast forward about 5 minutes. Somebody finally shows up with a set of bolt cutters. Shit, wouldn't you know it? One little snip of the chain and the boys are free. Couldn't have done that 10 minutes earlier. So it leads to the finishing sequence where the heels are about to put away Animal with a triple pile driver spot. Yes, for the record, the Varsity Club were literally about to beat the Road Warriors here. Think about that. But here comes Sting, Dog, and Hayes as they hit the ring to throw the match out. It is ruled a double disqualification as we see 9 guys brawling in and out of the ring. And JR's breaking into his classic hysteria commentary, putting over the chaos and selling it like a huge deal. And that was basically how the show ended. It was an extended angle more than anything. Yeah, points for attempts at creativity with the Sting, Hayes, and Dog angle, but why exactly did we need to swerve the audience? Did they just not want to do babyface versus babyface? Like, assuming that Hawk and Animal are good guys, I'm still not really sure. It's either that or somebody said, maybe we don't want to put the Dog in a TV main event for 10 minutes. I don't know what the deal was, but very strange timing to shoot an angle like that. But overall, that was the big pitch for the Chi-Town Rumble the following week. And as I said, we are going to review that pay-per-view on next week's Friday show. As far as the Clash goes, kind of goes back to what I talked about at the beginning of the report. With each passing event they run throughout the year, they're becoming more and more devalued. By far, and I don't even think it's close, out of the 5 Clash events we've reviewed, actually 4, if you count this one, because I stupidly forgot about the September one last year. But this has easily been the weakest of the bunch, right? I mean, think about the season's beatings from December. That card at least had Flair and Wyndham versus the Midnights. Clash before that, you had the Midnights versus Tully and Arn right before they left for the WWF. Going back to the earlier ones, you had the Midnights and the Fantastics, Sting and Flair. Like, those 88 cards had at least something of value in terms of drawing power. There really wasn't much of anything on this Clash 5 with drawing power on it. I mean, yeah, you had some names, but the matches were just kind of thrown together. You had a solid bout with the Fantastics and the Varsity Club for the U.S. tag titles, but that was about it. A main event 6-man that was good to get over the angle they set up previously, but other than that, you had the Flair Steamboat brawl, and it was a great piece of business. But when that's the main takeaway from your Clash event, and not necessarily anything pertaining to the matches, it's kind of problematic. I mean, that was the whole selling point of the Clash of Champions from the beginning. Check out all these high-profile quality matches that people are going to get to see for free. Now they're basically, like I said, they're just turning them into glorified house shows. And of course, coming up with Clash 6, that's where they're going to do Flair and Steamboat in the 2 out of 3 falls match. And that show does a terrible rating because they intentionally don't bother advertising anything beforehand. Drew a horrible house for that Superdome show. They basically had to tarp off a good portion of the building just to hide the fact that nobody was there. I think that was the catalyst that ultimately led to them firing George Scott. So, there was some good to come out of it. But that's the state of the Clash of Champions here in 1989. Some of the later ones this year, I think, see a bit of an uptick, both in ratings and overall fan intrigue. Because, they actually start fucking advertising them on television. Again, though, what did it take to get to that point? Another turnover with the booking committee. So here's a unique pair of commentators for Midsouth Television. Boyd Pierce and the Junkyard Dog. But you never thought you'd see that combination. Funny enough, I can't even really say it was a clash of styles. Definitely would not have been my first pick to have one of the boys sitting in to call play-by-play. And I know you're all probably thinking, wait a sec. Dog did play-by-play commentary for this episode? Sure did. Well, half the show at least. And it was surprisingly not terrible. It wasn't very good, don't get me wrong. But I was expecting way worse than what we got. Part of the problem, I think, is that you could tell Dog really didn't want to be there. We've talked about where JYD was mentally around this point in 84. You could tell he was already kind of starting to lose his passion around this point. Sort of in a clock in, clock out mode. And I'm not going to say he was phoning it in here with Boyd, because he really wasn't. But you could tell, even reading his body language in the opening couple minutes, Boyd's out there being this flamboyant, super animated personality. And Dog's just kind of sitting there looking over the format. Very dry, very disengaged. So it was kind of rough to sit through at times, especially if you were honing in on what the commentators were saying throughout the program. But they started off with a cool little Magnum TA pre-tape. showing some highlights of his matches over the last year, fan meet and greets, autograph signings. They did something fairly similar with Terry Taylor the other week, up to and including the photography session where Taylor was doing poses for magazine covers. They were having Magnum doing some of that stuff here. But this all kind of ties in with Midsouth experimenting with more on the production side of things here in 1984, trying to break the old formula of keeping all the segments contained at the Irish McNeil Boys Club. We've seen a lot more frequent video packages and highlight reels. Sometimes we get pre-tapes from the boys that they shoot, like Wrestling 2 and Magnum training in the gym. You know, it's funny because when you look at it with modern perspective, it doesn't really register the same way it probably would have back in the 80s when this is a newer concept they were trying out in the industry. For the time, it was really neat stuff. These simple 60-second pre-tape showing the boys outside the venues or outside the ring, just living life and doing cool shit. So we pitched to the ring for Brian Adias and Tommy Heggie versus the Midnight Express. Prior to the introductions, Jim Cornette got on the house mic and, well, he attempted to deliver a promo to the best of his abilities. His voice was completely shot for whatever reason. I don't know if he was sick or if he was doing a lot of screaming at the house shows and lost his voice. But he basically instills a vague threatening message to Bill Watts, saying that Watts made a lot of derogatory comments to him and his family. And if he persists, Cornette family may have to consider legal actions that'll either force Watts to be fired or work for Cornette personally. And of course, the best part in all this, he says this while looking directly into the hard cam. And behind everybody in the background, you see one of the fans holding up a giant drawing of Cornette. They basically drew Corny's head with a giant mohawk and buck teeth. That was great. I love that camera work. I'm also just going to ignore Corny wearing a captain's hat for this segment. No idea what the hell he was going for here, but it was very off-putting. Oh, one of my favorite bits of commentary in this match. Dog and Boyd are reflecting on what Corny was saying about Watts in his promo. And of course, Dog just being the dog. It's already hard to really understand what he was saying to begin with, but he basically chalks it up to idle threats. Boyd, on the other hand, nah, it's personal with him, brother. Sitting there saying, if Jim Cornette thinks he's going to target Bill Watts and make an example out of him, he has to go through me first. And I'm just sitting there laughing like, come on, Boyd. Just sit down and shut up. You ain't getting physical with anybody. Go through me first. Yeah, okay, Boyd. All 140 pounds of you. I know Cornette's gimmick was that he was a Weasley manager that couldn't whip cream with an outboard motor. But dude, even Cornette would easily be able to take Boyd in a fight. Anyway, the match is a quick enhancement to put the Midnights over. Really nothing too memorable about the action. Outside the one spot where Dennis gave Heggie a middle rope power slam and Corny wanted Dennis to pin him, Dennis just looked down and went, "Hell no." I was like, geez, Dennis. Call your jets, bro. A little early to be teasing tension with your group, isn't it? But they went over with their doomsday device. And then we came back for round 2 of the TV title tournament. And as we talked about the other week, the match was originally supposed to be Masayo Ito versus Hacksaw Duggan, but it ended up becoming Masayo versus Limpin' Lanny Poffo. That was because of an injury angle they shot with Duggan and the Russians during a coal miner's glove match in Tulsa. And I made the joke last week, considering the fact that Ito's been DQ'd in every single one of his televised matches because of the illegal nerve hold he's been using, was he going to purposefully screw himself out of $10,000 by doing the exact same thing to Poffo here? Surprisingly, the answer was no. They actually had a decent little pro wrestling match here. And the story was Poffo selling his knee for a good portion of the match while Ito went after him. Poffo doing a ridiculous amount of overselling to the point where you're just like, come on, dude, quit flopping around like a deer on ice skates. You're not auditioning for a fucking role in Hollywood. But Ito targeted the knee. Poffo fought back at certain points and tried to get a little dirty with the offense to stay alive. But then Ito fired back on him, caught him with a side kick to the head, and then he hit a running splash for the clean pin. So Ito advances to the next round. And the only other thing I noted here, I wish I could have given this same amount of time to Taylor and Landell last week. Because that was the biggest flaw with that first round match in the last episode. The fact that they were so pressed for time, they didn't really have a chance to do much of anything aside from a get your shit in match. But because they actually gave Ito and Poffo some time here, the match ended up having enough room to breathe. And it was good. And as it currently stands, Taylor and Ito are set to face each other in week 6, I believe. It's either week 6 or week 7. So we will see how things turn out there. Following that, we had Mr. Wrestling 2 and Larry Santana. Simply put, they had a very bare-bones grappling match for a few minutes. Wrestling 2 went over with a running knee lift. And then once we got all that petty, boring wrestling out of the way, now it's time to stir some shit up. Here come the Midnights to immediately jump 2 from behind. And because 2 is out there by himself for the match, he's not immediately flanked by Magnum to come out and save his back. So that gives the heels ample enough time to put the boots to 2 and go after the mask. Unfortunately for them, the dog was sitting in on commentary. And while it is a rule in the Midsouth area that if you're booked to do commentary, you can't get physically involved in any match or in-ring segment unless you're subject to a fine. And Dog makes enough money in Mid-South to say, fuck it, I'll eat the fine. $2,500. No, they pay me enough money, I'll be able to work that off in 2 weeks. So he hits the ring and starts throwing soup bones with Bobby and Dennis. Then, of course, a few seconds later, that's when Magnum comes out and tries to help a bit. A day and a half too late to the party, though. And while it is a very subtle thing that may not immediately be picked up on, I'm sure Wrestling 2 won't forget about this moment. As he's laying there on the mat wondering to himself, where's my tag partner to bail me out? All those times I saved his ass, he just left me to the wolves? And of course, if you know the timeline of where things are about to go with Magnum and Wrestling 2 as a tag team, It'll make more sense on a later date. And so we come back from break where JR's with the dog at ringside. And Jim's trying to get the dog to comment on his upcoming match with Nikolai Volkov in the TV title tournament next week. But first, Dog wants to address what we just saw moments ago. He's talking about how $2,500 is a lot of money to him. He ain't no rich man. He's got a family to support, mouths to feed. But if he has to pay the fine in order to do what's right and save his friends from brutal onslaughts, he would do it again in a heartbeat. He would pawn his rings, his gold chains, even his car. And of course, it's hilarious hearing Dog stand there and talk about all this, saying, I ain't no rich man. Meanwhile, he's got at least 50 grand's worth of jewelry on, plus that leather jacket that was an easy $500 to $800. Trust me, that wasn't fake leather. I've owned a couple leather jackets in my lifetime. They are not cheap. Now, of course, I'm not suggesting Dog was at Ric Flair's level in terms of wealth. But like him standing there trying to be a man of the people. Meanwhile, he's decked out in clothes and jewelry that 95% of the Louisiana population can never afford. Please. But he talked about Nikolai briefly and basically implied that he needs the $10,000 in order to help pay off the fine he owes Midsouth. Which again, I'm like, really, dude? You don't have $2,500 in your bank account right now? Find that very hard to believe. But eventually, here come the Russians to confront Dog. They end up challenging him to a fight right now. Because why wait until next week when we can just handle business right now? So Dog gets in the ring and waits for Nikolai. Meanwhile, on the floor, Crusher Darso attempts to sneak in to help Volkov. But he gets pulled down by Terry Taylor as those two start to brawl. And it basically leads to one of those big chaotic situations where a bunch of baby faces and heels empty out from the locker room. You get Messiah Uito down there. Magnum and Wrestling 2 join the fight. Believe it or not, and this actually made me laugh, they were saying the next scheduled match was supposed to be Joe Savoldi versus Buddy Landel. So because Buddy's fucking awesome, the minute Joe Savoldi tried to run out and help the babyfaces, Buddy cut him off at the pass and immediately ran him into the ring post. He did not give a fuck about anything else in that situation except one thing. He's like, I'm going to beat up Savoldi because I'm a bad guy. And that's what bad guys do. Everybody else is trying to separate the fight between the Russians and the Dog. Buddy's got his priorities straight. He saw Joe Savoldi and said, I'm going to get this motherfucker. So that was great. And by the way, we never actually got that match. I know you're all extremely disappointed. How could this show go on without Buddy Landel versus Joe Savoldi? Well, in fact, it did. We came back for Volkov and Darso versus John King and George Weingroff. We also had a very rapid-fire Russian national anthem performance from Volkov. They said, you got 30 seconds. Go. Sing. Overall, basic squash to put the Russians over. Darso picked up the win with the overhead backbreaker. Boyd really expressing his hatred for Turncoat Darso in this segment. We've now established the two most hated men on the roster on Boyd's list. Crusher Darso, and Jim Cornette. Now we just put him in a padded room and see which one Boyd tries to kill first. And back for another standby. We had Jim Neidhart taking on Jerry Gray. My only comment about this entire match, right before the bell, Neidhart did a pose in front of the hard cam to show off his back. He just goes, "Look at that." And I'm sitting there like, what exactly was he trying to show off? His love handles? His hairy spinal column? Yeah, I hate to break the news to y'all. Neidhart never had a great physique. There was no muscular tone to speak of. So I have no idea what he was trying to show off. Anyway, the match sucked. I don't even know how this happened. I think Gray may have accidentally potatoed Neidhart and busted him open hard way. Because I looked away at one point to type up some notes, and then I looked back up. Neidhart was gushing blood from his forehead. It was either that or he headbutted Gray so hard he opened himself up. But he ended up going over with a fallaway slam. And then with the remaining TV time we had left, we had Terry Taylor versus Tom Lentz. Hey, here's a question. Do you guys remember like 2 or so months back, they were making a huge deal out of this Tom Lentz guy coming into Midsouth? Then he had like one TV match and was immediately relegated to job duty. The hell happened? Again, it was a standby. Taylor predictably went over with a flying forearm. Or as they used to call it in Crockett when Manny Fernandez was around, the flying burrito. One of my favorite finishers at the time. Well, I guess in a few years, Taylor could have called it the running rooster wing. Still too soon. Figured as much. Yeah, another episode that had a few highlights here and there, but not a blowaway show on the whole. I love the advancement of what they're doing with the Midnight Express story. Their continual efforts to get under Bill Watts' skin. And the stuff with the Russians going after JYD to build up that tournament match for next week. That was well done. You know, aside from the Midnights, though, a lot of the show right now is being centered around the TV title tournament. And while that's not a bad thing, the issue I'm starting to see is that because they're only doing one round per week, they've already established this tournament's going to be drawn out for another several weeks. A lot of other stuff is taking a back seat in the meantime. Does anybody actually remember who the North American Heavyweight Champion is right now? I'm drawing a blank. I think it's still JYD, right? I don't even remember the last time they mentioned the title. The guy was sitting at the commentary desk this week and he never actually had the physical belt with him. And I know they're about to reveal the new championship title later this year. You're finally ditching that ugly old belt they were using for the previous several years. The one that's been held together with staples and Elmer's glue. But this has also been a recurring issue with Midsouth for the last 7 or 8 months. The lack of focus on the North American title picture. It's just weird to think how little attention that belt has gotten recently. But again, they're prioritizing other stuff, I guess. You know, the TV title's getting more focus as they're trying to make a big deal out of the medal and the 10 grand. And somewhere lurking in the bowels of the Irish McNeil Boys Club, there's a North American title that's sitting on a shelf collecting dust. Or it's in the Junkyard Dog's trunk. So last week we discussed the very heartbreaking story surrounding Gino Hernandez and his unexpected passing here in February of '86. It's probably the most tragic event to hit the Dallas area since the passing of David Von Erich just a couple years prior. And here we are a week later. We're obviously still in the recovery phase of everything. Granted, it's a tape show, so how much of this they already had in the can before they got the news about Gino, I'm not exactly sure. But it's a period with world class where there's a lot of attention on the product right now because of the Gino situation. Creatively, the on-screen stuff has been a lot better than what we were seeing through most of '85. And yeah, we're still a far cry from where business was at in '82, '83, most of '84. But even this week, I found myself enjoying a lot more of the show than normal. It wasn't a knock it out of the park home run from start to finish, but I'd say it was another strong taping block. Now, yet again, I have to do my obligatory everybody poke fun at the designated prelim curtain jerker Jack Victory. This is, I think, in counting the 9th consecutive week we've seen a Jack Victory match in the TV opener for world-class television. Can you even call it a rib at this point? I think it's beyond that. I think they're doing it deliberately to see how quickly they can run the guy out of the company. It's funny because it's never like he wrestles anybody of value. And I don't mean that as a knock on Dave Peterson, but for the majority of the people listening to this podcast, who the fuck is David Peterson? Exactly. I think if I actually go back and look at one of those 9 Jack Victory TV openers in the last 3 months, chances are we've already seen him wrestle Dave Peterson at least one time. Maybe more. And the only thing remotely worth mentioning in this match is Bill Mercer's comments on Gino, but I already kind of touched on that. I do encourage everybody to check out last week's episode to hear my analysis on the Gino thing, and especially to hear what I thought about the way Mercer talked about it publicly, because it was very interesting with how he addressed it. So I blanked out on about 2/3 of the match. The only thing I really noted was the comically terrible spot where Jack Victory went for a double axe handle off the middle rope. And when Dave Peterson went to roll out of the way, Victory basically did a face plant while he still had his hands clasped together. It was the wackiest sell for a missed axe handle I've ever seen. And they wrestle for another minute. Then out of the corner, Peterson caught Victory with a crossbody dive and a 3 count. So Dave Peterson won, I believe, his very first televised match. Clean as a sheet over Jack Victory. So in addition to Victory being nominated the curtain jerk toady, now he is doing jobs to underneath talent that never win matches to begin with. It used to be Victory would either find a way to win a match or it would end up going to a time limit draw. Now they're just blatantly 50-50 booking with him. It's funny how we talked about Jack Victory on this channel with both World Class and these WCW shows. And yet he's still the laughingstock of both companies. Seriously, think about that. This is the third Jack Victory match we've reviewed just this week. And he has done jobs in all three of those matches. First, he lost as a member of the Russian Assassins to the Midnight Express at the Clash. Then he had to come out an hour later dressed as the Blackmailer, only to lose to Lex Luger. And now here he is 3 years prior, losing to Dave Peterson in the TV opener to World Class. You know, there's a term for that in the wrestling business. And no, I'm not referring to the word jobber. I'm referring to a word even more degrading than that. Jack Victory is, by all accounts, a certified geek. So we followed that pre-tape with something they shot in Fort Worth the previous week. Now, on the last program, Bill Mercer made mention that Mike Von Erich was the recipient of the PWI Most Inspirational Wrestler of 1985. So we go to Fort Worth, where we see Bill Apter standing in the ring with Mike Carey and Mark Lawrence. An ironically hilarious moment taking place when Lawrence was about to pass the mic over to Bill to make the award presentation. He goes, "I'm going to stop talking because none of you came to hear me speak anyway." And you know what the fans did? They cheered. And it was so audible it actually popped Mark Lawrence. I had no idea Mark had that kind of nuclear level heat in Fort Worth. Though then again, I guess if you had to hear his commentary over the headset for all those years, you'd get sick of hearing his voice too. But that was funny. Never in the history of pro wrestling has a ring announcer ever been as over as a heel like Mark Lawrence. I think the closest we've come to him since then is Justin Roberts. But that's mainly just me that hates him. Most fans, for whatever reason, think he's the second coming of Howard Finkel. People are so dumb. This is actually really well done. Bill Apter actually got an entire building of fans to stand as he went to present Mike with the award. It was like, holy cow. I don't think I've ever seen anybody get an entire arena of fans to collectively stand for anything. Even for the national anthem. But this was a pretty big moment. And you could tell that Mike was genuinely grateful, even if his promo was absolute asshole. I mean, he tried to basically say that the fans were the true inspirations, but he didn't exactly get those words out because it's Mike. It's not to say Carey's promo was any better. The amount of times I heard him say the word inspiration or inspirational. God, if I'd have taken a shot for every time he said either of those words, I'd be dead. I believe at one point he also accidentally used the word expired instead of inspired. Probably not the best Freudian slip. Is he's supposed to be talking about Mike overcoming the brink of death, and he accidentally stumbles over himself and says, expired. Yeah. But seriously, this is good. And it wasn't done as an angle or anything to set up a storyline for television. It was just, here's Bill Apter to present Mike with his award, give Mike a little bit of a platform to talk about it, and that was it. And I think it's our first time seeing him back on television since the Cotton Bowl, right? Obviously, he's going to be getting back in the ring very soon. Even though I think it was very apparent that he still wasn't fully at 100% by the time he came back. But Fritz was kind of pushing him a little bit. Or a lot of bit. And that pressure is about to lead to more heartbreak and tragedy within the coming year, unfortunately. Just the continual downward spiral of this company over the next few years. Just one blow after another. Then we had Mark Youngblood and the Iceman taking on Michael Hayes and Buddy Roberts. You know, people often talk about studying film and wrestling and trying to learn from the all-time greats. I will say this up front. It should be a requirement for all WWE developmental talent to watch Fabulous Freebird matches. Regardless of whether or not they're working in a tag team with anybody. They are the prime examples of guys that always knew how to get the most out of doing the bare minimum. And that's not a bad thing, trust me. There's a reason there's a phrase, work smart instead of work hard. I think a lot of people in the business today ought to heed that advice. But they could literally get reactions from the crowd by just looking sideways at them. Even simple things like acting all cocky and brash when they're in control. Then you see them conspiring together to attempt to do some kind of illegal double team move. But then they get thwarted and they start throwing a tantrum in the ring. Like, this is the kind of shit you don't see enough of in wrestling today. Bad guys blatantly trying to cheat in plain view of everybody, but then getting their comeuppance before they can even execute it. I mean, it was a very basic tag that still had plentiful amounts of great stuff in it. Hayes and Roberts bumping around for the baby faces early on. Hayes and the Iceman trying to one-up each other constantly with their goofy little struts. They end up cutting off the Iceman and working him over temporarily before Youngblood gets in there and starts making his comeback on the heels. Then we get the double bonk spot where Hayes and Roberts are sent into each other. And right as it's looking like the baby faces are in control of things, Hayes sneaks in when Roberts catches Youngblood on his shoulders. And he comes off the top with a chop to the back of Youngblood's neck. Then Roberts hits a corkscrew elbow drop and gets the pin. Now, it's not on the same level of what we saw back when the Freebirds were doing this kind of stuff to the Von Erichs every week. But even just the mere presence of the Freebirds on these world-class tapings in early '86, God, it brings so much life and energy to these shows. And yeah, you're not getting technical masterpieces when they're in the ring, especially with Michael Hayes. But you're sure as hell getting a reaction out of the crowd. And again, that's the beauty of going back and watching Freebirds matches. And they're not going to bring you 5-star classics, but they're sure as fuck going to sell tickets and put butts in the seats. Even when they're working with guys who aren't necessarily top of the card. So when we come back from break, we had sort of a double featured segment involving some comments from some of the boys on Gino's death, as well as a follow-up on the condition of Chris Adams. I'll start with Gino. And again, it goes back to everything I talked about with the way Bill Mercer addressed it during the announcement last week. You had a mixture of baby faces and heels talking about Gino in these little pre-tape promos. And Michael Hayes put him over, said that Gino was a guy that lived life in the fast lane, saw more life in 29 years than most people do in their entire lives, and talking about how he'll be greatly missed. And then you had guys like David Manning and Kerry Von Erich that were very open about the fact that they didn't see eye to eye with Gino on a lot of things, but they can never take away from his athletic skill or his hard work over the years. And it's one of those things where even the babyfaces acknowledge, hey, the guy wasn't the most popular in the Dallas region. He ruffled a lot of feathers along the way and caused an uproar. But he was a hell of a talent, and nobody could deny the legacy he left on the business. And that's truthfully about the best way you could have good guys talk about heels without completely exposing the business and breaking kayfabe. Especially people that were fans of the Von Erichs, because nobody wants to hear Kerry, Kevin, or Mike put over Gino in the same way a Michael Hayes would. That would have killed the Von Erichs entirely if, people started getting word that they respected Gino like a brother, or they would hang out with him during off hours. And of course, I say all this now, but people wouldn't even think twice of it these days. We all know kayfabe has been dead for years. But they still had to protect the business around this point to the best of their abilities, even during truly horrible moments like what happened with Gino. But again, it goes back to the level of respect they used to have for the business. And I think Gino would respect that too. Because he was smart. He understood. And as far as Chris goes, the story with him right now is that he's on his way back to the UK. And because he's still selling the angle of having the hair cream thrown into his eyes, causing him to go temporarily blind, well, we see Bill Mercer outside his home in Dallas, and he's getting ready to travel to the airport. Not him behind the driver's wheel, by the way. He's obviously being escorted by his wife. And Mercer's able to get in a few words with him, asking what his plans are, what the future holds. And Chris is very open and says he doesn't know what his future holds. Right now, he's just going to go spend time with his family and hope that over time the horrific injury heals. But he's pretty much convinced his in-ring career is over. And it's obviously a very heavy story they're trying to tell right now. And when you tie all this in with the Gino thing, the gravity of the situation hits you that much harder. I found that very interesting, though, here. They never brought up Gino's name. This is all about trying to wish Chris a speedy recovery and hope that somehow through a miracle of God, he's able to regain his vision back over time. But he's in a very catastrophic state of mind right now. It was a good performance from everybody. Chris is a clear-cut babyface. They're leveraging as much sympathy with him as they possibly can. And I think Bill did a great job putting over the fact that it's hard to see Chris in this predicament. But there's not a whole lot you can do aside from waiting around and seeing how things turn out. Give Chris a chance to heal. Let him take the time off to be with his family. And maybe we'll see him again in the future. Oh, spoiler. We'll be seeing him again in the future. Figure I at least throw you all a bone in case you were sitting there in tears wondering whether or not we'll ever see Chris Adams again. But let's go ahead and talk about the TV main event. Rick Rude defending the American Heavyweight Championship against Lance Von Erich. The forgotten Von Erich. Now, of course, as I look at the runtime for the remainder of the show, I'm like, there's still well over 10 minutes left in the program. Surely they're not going to have Lance wrestle Rick Rude for 10 minutes. Well, they definitely tried to stall for as much time as they could. They had Percy Pringle waste about 2 minutes removing Rick's jacket. Then they had Lance hit like 2 moves on Rude, only for Rude to argue with David Manning about illegal cheap shots for another couple minutes. And I'm sitting there like, okay, I see what they're doing. They're Jack Victorying the segment by having the heels stall for time as much as humanly possible to run out the clock. Clever stuff. In this case, it was totally strategic, trying to cut back on the amount of time people saw Lance in the ring. Can't blame him. But this is probably the longest match we've seen Lance work up to this point. And I know I'm giving him a hard time here, but it actually wasn't a bad match. Lance was definitely throwing some of those Jey Uso-like hot dog punches at the very end, whiffing shots left and right. That should kind of look like the way Kerry throws punches. And that was definitely not Kerry's strong suit when it came to his in-ring work. But they had a cool little sequence where Percy wanted Rude to go for the Rude Awakening DDT, but Lance fought out. There's a spot where he gets the sleeper hold on Rude, but Rude's able to shoot off with his foot in the corner and then push Lance back into David Manning. So while David's down selling, Lance tries to go behind on Rude near the ropes, but then Percy reaches in and smacks Lance over the back of the head with his cane, which allows for Rude to climb on top and get the pin. This is a good little heat finish. Again, Lance is kind of a what you see is what you get type performer. He's still moderately over with the crowd. He's not a bad worker by any stretch. I think he gets a bad rap from a lot of people, but you can tell they're so desperately trying to force him in the same class as Kerry and Kevin are, and it just doesn't work when you see it in real time. As a performer, he's slightly better than Mike, which is not much of an improvement. They've obviously been building up tension with him in the Pringle Dynasty on TV. So I guess we're going to continue to see him intermingle with this feud for the interim. I don't think they end up putting the American Heavyweight title on him, which, thank God for small favors. But that's kind of all there was to it. A serviceable main event that really didn't move the needle one way or the other. All in all, the bulk of the program this week was an extension of them talking about Gino. The tag match with the Freebirds was good, but it's a lot like how things were when David died a couple years ago. Company's still kind of in a mourning period right now. And they try to carry on with regular story content, but it was already going to be hard to care about all that stuff following the news about one of your top guys dying. But I still like the show. The Chris Adams pre-tape, well, it's definitely sad to see him with the patches over his eyes, selling the fact that he's blind. It was a good segment to put over the story. And that'll be the last time we see Chris for a couple of months. Might even be longer than that. I don't think we see Chris come back until like May. Meanwhile, things are going to continue to chug along as we eventually start gearing up for the 3rd annual Texas Stadium event in a few months. Now, by this point, World Class had already withdrawn from the NWA Alliance. So we're pretty much at a point where they're relying on their own original guys to carry the load. And that's also been a thing we talked about with World Class. The unfortunate lack of star power. I mean, you still got the Von Erichs, you got the Freebirds, you got Rick Rude, I guess, the Iceman. But it's a struggle. It really is. Like we talked about before, we're about to lose Kerry later this year because of the motorcycle accident. So that's another top guy that's going to be out of the picture. Ugh. You hate to see it. But as they keep chugging along with their storylines, we'll keep chugging along with everything for the time being. Thanks everybody for tuning in to this week's Friday show. We will be back this coming Monday for Retro Raw. And then the following week we'll have the In Your House review as well as Retro Raw. And I don't think the Elimination Chamber is until first week of March, I want to say. So we've still got a little bit of time. But that'll do it for now. Thanks everybody for watching, and we'll catch you all soon. Take care. Peace out.